Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Nick. Good evening, everyone. Welcome and thanks for coming out tonight. So we're going to take a look at the burnt sacrifice or the burnt offering tonight, and obviously that's one of a number of different sacrifices under the law, and there is, I guess, a bit of a tendency to get to this part of Leviticus or this part of the Bible even, and potentially find it a little bit overwhelming with all the detail and potentially skip a few chapters here and there when you're doing the readings. What we want to try and do tonight is try and get a little bit of the bigger picture of where Leviticus fits in. Then we'll take a look at the order of what a sacrifice means just in general. And then we'll take a look specifically at the burnt offering, which is one of the offerings. And you've got a worksheet which hopefully will help with a lot of the detail to just condense it down into a helpful summary, I hope. But what we want to do is not just look at what actually was offered, but look at what the meaning of that sacrifice actually is or was. So that's what we want to do tonight. So the big picture is that Leviticus fits between Exodus and Numbers. And if you go to the previous page in your Bible, the end of Exodus, you'll see a little bit of detail, kind of summarizing in chapter 40 of Exodus, summarizing the setup of the tabernacle. So if you were to go through Exodus, the previous chapters, there's all this detail about how each article was made and who made it and things like that. In fact, if you go back even more chapters, you get detail about the instructions of how it was to be made, and then you get the detail of how it was made. And then chapter 40, you've got Moses putting it all together. And the tabernacle was established. You've got the children of Israel at Sinai putting up the tabernacle, and he puts all the articles in, the table of showbread, the altar of incense, etc., etc. And if you have a look at let's look at verse 34. Verse 33, he read up the court round about the tabernacle and the altar, set up the hanging of the court gate. So Moses finished the work. So the tabernacle's built, assembled, furnished. Then you've got verse 34. Then a cloud covered the tent of the congregation, and the glory of Yahweh filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter into the tent of the congregation because the cloud abode thereon, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. So you've gone from Moses actually putting it all together, actually going in there and putting the Ark of the Covenant in its place, actually putting all the other articles in its place, and then all of a sudden God's glory filled it and Moses was excluded from it. Have a look at verse 1 of Leviticus. We just read this. Yahweh called unto Moses and spake unto him out of the tabernacle. What's the implication there? Moses is not in it. Okay, God's in it. Moses is outside. When you come over to the end of Leviticus, actually to the start of the next book, which is Numbers, and we're trying to get the big picture here of what's the point of Leviticus. You come to the start of Numbers, and chapter 1, verse 1, it says, And Yahweh spake unto Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, in the tabernacle of the congregation. So we've gone from Moses not being allowed in the tabernacle, God speaking to him from within the tabernacle with Moses outside, and then you've got the book of Leviticus, which is basically God communicating these laws to Moses. And then we've got Moses in the tabernacle and God speaking with him in the tabernacle. So it's a bit of a transition. And really we can think of it a bit like this. Moses, you can imagine how setting up the tabernacle, it could have almost been like a little bit too familiar. Like he'd been in there, he'd been handling all these articles of furniture and all that sort of thing. God was emphasizing his holiness, his separateness, if you like, his sanctity. And the book of Leviticus is about showing Moses and the people that God has to be treated as holy and with respect. And there's a lot of information about how mankind, humanity, is not naturally holy. And we've got all these tendencies to be sinners. And Leviticus is about here's how God brings us back to himself. And so we start with Moses excluded from the tabernacle. We end with him in the tabernacle. And just if you're familiar with Hebrew writings, you might be familiar with what's called a chiasma. Anyone know what a chiasma is? Matthew, what's a chiasma? Get an English teacher to explain the Hebrew.
It's sort of a mirrored writing structure where the first idea corresponds to the last idea, and they sort of work inwards towards the central idea.
Perfect. And the whole book of Leviticus is one of these chiasmi, I don't know, where the ideas, the concepts are kind of mirrored around a central idea. And this slide, I don't know how well you can see it. Hopefully you can see the breakup. Chapter 1 to 7, we've got all the sacrifices, and we're going to start getting to that shortly. And it's kind of mirrored if you flip to the bottom of the slide, where you've got the feasts and that sort of thing. So sacrifices at one end of Leviticus, the feasts at the other end. The second part of Leviticus, after the sacrifices have been detailed, there's information about how the priests were ordained and the process of Aaron and his sons sort of coming into that role and being sanctified. And then the mirror part towards the end of the book of Leviticus, chapter 21 to 22, goes to the qualifications of a priest and how they had to be, a certain age. They couldn't have a broken nose. They had to wear certain clothing, that kind of idea. So it's mirrored. It's about the priests. The next section of Leviticus, chapter 11 to 15, is about physical cleanness. So you're thinking about things that they couldn't touch, things that they couldn't eat because it would make them unclean, and the processes of how to go from being unclean to clean. Like if you touched a dead body, well, what do you do to become counted as clean again? And the mirror part of that, chapter 18 to 20, is about moral cleanness. So laws about how to be morally pure, if you like. So no fornication and adultery, that kind of thing. Don't lie, don't steal. So the idea of your character matching cleanness. And it's all mirrored around chapter 16 and 17. So it's kind of like, to a Hebrew reader, the attention is being pointed at this central concept, Day of Atonement, which we're probably familiar with enough to say the Day of Atonement was this one special day where the people of Israel reflected on the fact that they had sinned, and as a nation, the whole nation, in symbol, I suppose, confessed that they were sinners, and God forgave them for their sin. So the whole central idea is of there being an acknowledgement that we're sinners, and of God redeeming the people and bringing the people to himself. And so that's kind of the big picture, a little yellow dot to highlight the central point, Day of Atonement. And in that, we've got the sacrifices. It's kind of like the first piece of this puzzle, if you like, puzzle being, how does mankind go from this state of sinfulness, separated from God, to being in fellowship with God? Again, how does Moses go from being excluded from the tabernacle to being able to enter and to commune with God in the tabernacle? So the sacrifice is the first part of that. Let's talk about the sacrifices as a bit of an overview now. Leviticus 1 through to 7 is where we find the information about the different sacrifices. And there's actually, there's 5 main types of sacrifices or offerings, if you like, that are detailed in these first 7 chapters. We're going to start with the one that we read in chapter 1. That's what Leviticus starts with, is the burnt offering. And then you've got the meal, or if you read the King James Version, it'll call it a meat offering, but it's not actually meat, it's meal, it's like grain or flour. Peace offering, sin offering, and trespass offering. These are the ones that Leviticus starts off detailing. There's actually other offerings. There's more throughout Leviticus later on. There's things like drink offerings. Nehemiah even talks about a wood offering. So there's more offerings than these, but these are the big five, if you like. Leviticus kind of separates, it kind of covers each of the offerings twice. You can kind of think of them as just general rules and then priestly rules. It doesn't necessarily read that way all the time, but essentially there's two sets of details about what was meant to happen in each of the sacrifices. So you'll notice there's Leviticus 1 that we read about the burnt offering, and then there's a bit more in chapter 6 and 7 as well. Before we dive into the detail, let's just think about what a sacrifice actually is. Now, we're not going to turn up these passages. I've put them on the screen so that we can talk about them reasonably quickly. Let's just skim through them. Psalm 40 verse 6, sacrifice and offering thou didst not desire. Burnt offering and sin offering hast thou not required. Psalm 51, thou desirest not sacrifice. Thou delightest not in burnt offering. Jeremiah 7, God says, I didn't speak to your fathers or command them about burnt offerings or sacrifices. What I really commanded was obey my voice. Hosea 6, I desired mercy and not sacrifice. I desired the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. Who knows what Micah 6 verse 6 to 8 says?
You've shown your mercy. What does the Lord require thee to justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God?
Right. Not rivers of blood from animal sacrifices. Not all the animals of the hills killed and burnt to God. Okay. What does God really require is those things. So we've got all these verses that actually tell us, we're about to embark on a bit of an examination of the burnt sacrifice. And actually we've got these verses saying, hang on, God didn't really want these sacrifices. They're not really what God delighted in specifically. So the reason I flag these passages is really to say, well, what's the point of a sacrifice? And the answer, I think, is that the sacrifices were, I guess you can think of them in two ways, a teaching tool. They were designed to teach the people principles, such as the principle of man deserves to die, sinners deserve death. And secondly, kind of the same thing, but from the different perspectives, a sacrifice was a way for an offerer, a person, to demonstrate principles. So I think that's probably the key word I'd suggest at this point. Think of the sacrifices as a demonstration. And this counts for any sacrifice. I mean, if we're talking about the sacrifice of the Lord Jesus Christ, there's a demonstration of principles in that sacrifice. And on the one hand, it's teaching people something. So God's teaching us. On the other hand, the sacrifice is demonstrating something from people giving the sacrifice. So keep that in mind. We're going to look at the burnt sacrifice. It's demonstrating something. Hopefully by the end of tonight, we will know what that is.
Sorry, Phil, can you just say what the two purposes of the sacrifices were again?
Demonstrate something from God to us. Teach something, in other words. Or demonstrate something from the offerer, in a sense, speaking back to God. So the offerer is demonstrating the principles that they have now understood from having learnt principles God has taught. That probably confused you even more. But it all comes down to, it's a demonstration, either God demonstrating something to us or the person giving the sacrifice choosing or perhaps being required to demonstrate something themselves.
Sorry.
Not an outward expression of an inward feeling.
That's a good way of putting it. It's an outward expression of what the person is thinking or feeling. Yeah.
Could you just go back to the previous slide?
This slide, by the way, is a handy little thing to just write at the bottom of your page on Leviticus 1. And what I've done as a little Bible marking suggestion is color-coded each of those 5 sacrifices and just put an outline using that pencil color.
Some are grey and some are white.
Yeah. That's right. Yes, if you've got a grey pen, you can use that. Thanks for explaining that. Let's move on. Okay. Now, this is the point at which your sheet is going to be useful because what we're going to be doing for the next little bit is going into a little bit of the detail of what actually happened in these offerings. And this sheet, you can kind of just fill it in from what we skim through. I'm not going to be probably referring specifically to the sheet, but I'll be talking about what's in the slides, I suppose, and you can just copy it down as we go. So the reason for the offering, that's the first question. Here's the answer. Actually, the reason, well, it was voluntary. So a person would choose to make a burnt sacrifice. It wasn't, and let me clarify that. There may have been, in fact, there were times when God said, a person will be offering a burnt sacrifice on this occasion or for this reason. Okay, so there might have been mandated burnt sacrifices, but just as a general rule, the burnt sacrifice was something that a person would say, I want to give this to God. I want to do this offering. It's a voluntary thing or a free will offering, if you like. Okay, what could be offered? Let's keep going. There's actually more detail than what we read tonight. We just read up to verse 13. And what we read was that it could be a male from the herd, so in other words, a bull, and that's in verse 5, chapter 1. Or it could be a male from the flock, and that could be either a sheep or a goat, so a young ram or a young billy goat. That's in verse 10. Or an offerer, and this is the bit we didn't get to in verse 14 onwards, an offerer could actually bring some birds, an offering of turtle doves or young pigeons. Okay, and the law is really specific for the burnt offering, particularly in relation to the bulls or the rams or the goats, that the animal had to be without blemish. None of my animals qualify. It had to be like no bruises, no cuts, no bent legs or whatever. It was let's use the word perfect, because that's kind of what we're thinking here. It was a perfect animal. It had no problems with it. Now, by the way, we're going to talk through the details or the little aspects of the law. Then we'll come back through some of these key points and try and think about what is it actually teaching? What is the symbol pointing at here? What is it representing? Okay, so that's what was offered. Next, the procedure. The procedure is slightly different depending on the type of animal, but essentially it goes like this. If you had a bull, the animal would be killed at the door of the tabernacle, and it actually says that that's before Yahweh. So it's kind of like the person would imagine that they're right in God's presence. Obviously, they couldn't go right into the most holy place, but they were right at the door of the tabernacle, just in front of God, and they're killing the animal right there. It says in verse 4 that the person making the offering would actually put their hands on the head of the animal. And we'll talk about what that means shortly. It was killed by the offerer, so the person would kill it themselves. And I imagine probably in that time people were quite used to that kind of thing, but maybe there was times when someone needed assistance, particularly with a bull, like a bullock. I've needed assistance with a sheep. So like it's Yeah, but the key was that the person doing the offering would have their hands on the head and they would kill it. And it says that the blood was sprinkled around the base of the altar by the priest. So picture, just picture the scene. Like imagine the tabernacle there. The person making the offering would bring their animal to the door of the tabernacle, and with the priests there beside them, they'd be putting their hands on the head of the animal. They obviously had a very sharp knife of some kind, and they would cut the throat of the animal. There'd be a priest probably with a bowl catching the blood, and then the priest would take that blood and sprinkle it around the base of the altar. And to us, that's kind of grisly. Maybe it was to the Hebrews as well, and maybe there's something in that. Maybe there's something that was being taught. Okay, so just remember, we're thinking of these sacrifices not so much as meaningless rituals, not just like something people had to do without thinking about it and just this is what God wants kind of thing, but actually we're thinking of these as things God was asking to teach something and things that God was telling people to do so that the person could demonstrate something in return to God.
Bill, I don't know if they had more than one pair of clothes, but do you think they had their special, I'm going to make an offering clothes? I imagine this would be quite messy.
It would have been very messy. So all those pictures of priests dressed in pure white,
Yeah,
picture them actually
that's day one.
lots of red.
Yeah.
And we know that there was the laver in the courtyard of the tabernacle, lots of washing. Yeah. Look, let's keep going through the detail. Just
Was the first one to your or Yahweh, is that just relevant to the bull? What other birds? Bull, yeah.
yes and no, and I'll answer that now. Actually, I'll answer in a moment. There's more detail to the bull. It tells us in verse 6, that's actually, I'll read it to you. He shall flay the burnt offering and cut it into his pieces. Now, to flay it actually means that the skin was removed, and the idea is that the skin's actually spread out. Okay, to flay it, you spread the skin out, and the idea is, again, remember this animal had to be without blemish, perfect. So the spreading out of the skin kind of gives the impression that there was an inspection going on of this animal's skin. It actually tells us in chapter 7 that the priest got to keep the skin. So the priest who was there officiating for this offering would actually have the skin for himself. The animal was cut into its pieces, head, shoulders. So the legs. So if you can picture an animal in your mind, Nick can probably someone who's lives on a farm can probably explain this better. But if you were skinning it, you'd probably cut it around about where the knees are, maybe just below, and that's where the skin got cut. So below that, the skin would still be attached, right? You don't sort of peel the skin off the hooves. So there's a little bit of skin on the bottom of the leg. That got washed. The insides got washed. Now, if anyone's ever been involved in sort of slaughtering and butchering of an animal, the insides are actually reasonably clean until someone punctures the guts and all this excrement spills out. So that's the stuff that really was needing to be cleaned, right? Washing the inwards is washing out all the yucky stuff inside. The actual, like the meat, for instance, the muscle and all that is actually really quite clean. Been inside the skin all its life. So there's washing the head, so the parts of the head, the fats, the washed entrails and legs were all burnt on the altar. And just have a look at verse 9. I'll just mention something briefly here. So it says in verse 9, his inwards and his legs shall he wash in water. The priest shall burn all on the altar to be a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire of a sweet savour unto Yahweh. That word burn there is actually a kind of slightly different Hebrew word to what you'd normally expect. Normally when you read burn, you'd expect, okay, this is about consuming something with fire. And that's what the typical Hebrew word for burn means. This particular Hebrew word is actually it's the word katar, and it actually is associated with burning of frankincense or incense. And rather than just meaning burn it up with fire, it actually means to turn something into that sweet aroma that you get from incense. So there's a little bit more to it than what we read in English here. The burnt offering is not about just consuming something so that there's nothing left. It's actually about turning it into a sweet aroma that went to God. And so you picture the smoke as it would arise. And actually, I should have mentioned the Hebrew word for the burnt sacrifice is olah, and it just means to ascend. And so you got this picture of this smoke going up, ascending to God, and it's a sweet aroma to God. So in other words, this is the offerer giving something to God in a sense, or if you like, demonstrating something to God, and it's coming up to God as a sweet aroma. It's a pleasing thing. It's something like this is a really special sacrifice. I don't think it's by chance that this is the first sacrifice in the book of Leviticus. It's the offerer voluntarily demonstrating something here, and it's pleasing to God.
But normally burning flesh would not smell nice, would it?
Depends on if you're a vegan or not. No, look, sometimes it would. Like sometimes if you're burning an animal, it just smells like a good barbecue. So it's not to say that normally it wouldn't smell good, but this it was actually like the burning of incense, and the smoke was just a nice smell. I mean, you can get this burning hair smell, which is terrible. So it's true that not all burning flesh smells good, but definitely this one did.
Bill, do you know it's the same category as the continual burnt offering?
We'll come to that. Don't jump the gun.
Exactly.
Okay, a little bit of slight differences. If it was a ram, I don't think there's a space on the sheet here. You probably figure out if there is or not. But if it was a ram, it's almost the same. Just a couple of differences. It actually specifies it was killed on the north side of the altar, and there is this reference in chapter 7 to the place where they killed these things. So it seems to me that when the bullock, it says, was killed before the tabernacle, it was probably on the northern side of the altar. So if you picture the tabernacle in your mind, imagine you've just walked in through the curtains, you're in the outer court, you've got the altar of burnt offering on the right-hand side, and the laver over on the left-hand side. And you've come in from the east, so the north is to your right-hand side, and that's where all these killings would have happened. All these killing the animal for a sacrifice. There was a specific spot. The laying of hands doesn't actually get mentioned for the ram, but it looks like it was done because chapter 8, which is talking about how the priests were ordained, actually talks about Aaron and his sons doing the same thing with the ram. So it looks like it's the same idea, just a different animal. And again, it doesn't talk specifically about the skinning, but we've still got chapter 7 saying whichever priest did the offering gets the skin. So it seems like it's probably just a general principle that they would skin it, spread the skin out, or flay it, and the priest would keep that bullock or ram, it would seem. Now the birds were an option, and it looks like that was, and this is perhaps informed by some of these other offerings. It looks like the birds were an option, particularly for someone who's poor. Not everyone would have a bull or a ram that they would be able to sacrifice. And you always got poor people, they would be able to at least go and catch a bird or something, and offer a couple of birds maybe. A couple of differences. So you don't get the offerer putting his hands on the head of the bird, because that's kind of the whole animal under their hands thing. So the priest would just get the bird, wring its neck off, and then they'd kind of turn the bird upside down and squeeze the blood out around the altar. Not much point trying to squeeze it into a bowl. There's not that much blood in a bird. They'd squeeze it out around the altar. So in a sense, it's kind of the same thing, but it's just slightly different for a bird, obviously, because it's a smaller animal. And there's a few more little specifics there. Let's keep going. Any questions? Okay. Let's talk about what it signifies. What's it all trying to teach? The first passage there, we won't worry about turning this one up. 2 Chronicles 7 is about the dedication of the temple. So remember, Solomon built the temple and he offered a great big chapter-long prayer to dedicate the temple. And then there's a fire from heaven that consumed all these burnt sacrifices. And the burnt sacrifices were a key feature of the dedication of the temple. And that will make sense when we look at this next passage, because I think Mark 12 is probably the best passage for explaining exactly what this burnt sacrifice was meant to symbolize or represent. Come over to Mark chapter 12. Nat, I'm going to pick on you. Do you mind reading, please, verse 32 and 33 of Mark chapter 12? The context here, remember, is Jesus getting all these questions and he answered them all, like what happens if a man has, if a man dies and his wife's left with no children, etc. That's the context. Thanks, Nat. Maybe let's go actually from verse 28 and maybe just read along. Mark chapter 12, verse 28.
Yeah, Mark 12, verse 28. And one of the scribes came, and having heard them reasoning together, and perceiving that he had answered them well, asked him, which is the first commandment of all?
And Jesus answered him, the first of all the commandments is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. Next.
Go right.
And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength.
And the second blanket is this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than this. And the scribe said to him, You are right, teacher. You have truly said that he is one, and there is no other besides him. And to love him with all the heart, and with all the understanding, and with all the strength, and to love one neighbor as oneself, it is much more than all burnt offerings and sacrifices.
Okay, excellent. Let's pause there. So remember we started out with that list of passages that said God doesn't actually want burnt sacrifices. Well, this young scribe with this question here actually made the connection as well. And can you look specifically at verse 33 at the connection that he made? He's connected the idea of loving Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Okay, the first and great commandment. He's connected that and the second commandment as well, loving your neighbor. He's connected that with the idea of the whole burnt offering. So when you think of those terms, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength, you can summarize that as love God with everything, all of you, every bit of it, all your energy, all your emotion, all your strength. And this young scribe was saying, yeah, that's so much more than the burnt offerings. And really what he's saying is that's what the burnt offerings were teaching about. The actual principle of a burnt offering was, here's someone burning a whole animal. And that burning of the whole animal was a symbolic way of saying, I want to give it all to God. I want to dedicate my whole life, my whole heart, soul, mind, and strength to God. And so the previous chapter that we didn't turn up, 2 Chronicles 7, a dedication of the temple. We're going to give this temple to God. It's to God's service. So there's a dedication sacrifice, which is the burnt sacrifice. It's saying we're giving everything to God here. So let's think about the big picture then. The demonstration in this sacrifice. Actually, let's go through the symbols, and you can maybe fit these in. So the burnt offering, this is on your worksheet, the significance. The burnt offering spoke of dedication to God, if you like, whole body, heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the passage, particularly, I would suggest, is Mark 12, verse 32 and 33. But here's the symbols. So let's talk through each of these. It was killed before Yahweh, and it's kind of like, I'm bringing this to your attention, God. The person bringing the sacrifice was coming right in front of God, as if they're saying something to him. Okay, it's bringing it to God's attention. It's actually on the north side of the altar, which lines up with where Jesus was killed, on the northern side of the city of Jerusalem. And there's passages in Hebrews that we're not going to have time to look at now, but talking about how Jesus suffered outside of the city, but more on that another time. I guess I included that just to make us start thinking as well about these sacrifices pointed forward to the Lord Jesus Christ as well. And we'll look at a particular way in which the burnt sacrifice did that in a moment. The person making the offering would put their hands on the head of the animal, and that was the principle of identifying with the animal. So it's kind of like saying, this animal represents me. And with, as we just said, the whole animal was burnt to God, and the person was essentially saying, just like this animal that's completely given to God, this is what I'm trying to do in my life. I'm trying to give my complete self to God, my whole heart, soul, mind, and strength. If you're still writing those down, I'm sorry, we're going to keep going. The blood was sprinkled around about the altar. Blood is used throughout the scripture as a symbol of life. And we're not going to turn up those passages, but we did read in Leviticus chapter 1, when Paul did the reading, that there's an element of atonement in this sacrifice. So atonement, think of it as forgiveness of sins. Think of it as becoming at one with God. And it says in verse 4 of Leviticus 1, the offerer would put his hand upon the head of the burnt offering, and it shall be accepted for him to make atonement for him. And so in the action of this sacrifice, an offerer was actually making acknowledgement of sin, and we'll see how in a moment. And even though it wasn't specifically a sin offering where someone was guilty of something specific, there was this sort of aspect of blood, a life given, and those are the principles that God has in place. We won't turn up Hebrews, but it says, without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sin. And so there was shedding of blood here. It was associated with the altar. And I've got there, this is an English teacher thing as well. Hebrews 13 verse 10 talks about the altar as Christ. And it's a figure called metonymy. The best example of metonymy I have is when there's a fraternal tea and the announcer says, can all the sisters bring a plate? and they're not actually talking about bring a plate along, they're talking about the stuff on it. So saying bring a plate means bring a plate of food. So that's metonymy. The altar is spoken of as Christ because he is the sacrifice, the ultimate sacrifice that went on the altar. There's a lot of detail there, but we're going to skim over it. Let's continue. Yes.
Quickly, blood sprinkled around on altar. Is that like on the altar? It's around on it, or is it literally around?
Around the base, like I believe it was actually on the altar, but around the base, so sprinkled, kind of like that.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, let's continue. So this is more the specifics again. I remember the animal was skinned and cut up into pieces. The inwards and the legs were washed. And the picture, remember, the offerer had put his hands on the animal and basically in symbol was saying, this animal is me. And the idea of cutting up the animal into its pieces and examining it for any blemishes was really like the offerer saying, I'm opening myself up to God here. And the washing, we're washing away all the impurities. And again, like, how can we be forgiven if we're not acknowledging that sin is wrong and trying to get rid of it from our lives? The burnt sacrifice had in it the element of atonement, and it makes sense because the person was in symbol washing away sin by washing away the uncleanness, the filth of this beast, and saying, this is me, I'm trying to wash away the sin in my life, the uncleanness. And the whole animal then, once it was cleaned, was all burnt and given to God. And the offerer was saying, I'm dedicating my whole being to God. The skin, we said, was given to the priest, and that makes sense, doesn't it? The skin wasn't burnt and given to God, in a way saying God's not actually interested in the outward appearance. Remember what God said to Samuel when God sent him to anoint David, and Jesse's sons paraded before him, and he saw the first one alive, and he said, wow, this has got to be God's anointed here. God said, no, God doesn't look on the outward appearance. God's looking on the heart. God's interested on what's on the inside. And so the skin doesn't go to God. What's on the outward, it's either washed away or not burnt at least, because God's interested on what's in the inside. Okay, so you can think of the way that the animal was pieced up as corresponding in some sense. It might not line up perfectly, I'm not sure, but you can think of it as kind of being like the heart, soul, and strength, heart, soul, mind, and strength. So you've got these different parts of the beast. The head obviously would be the mind. The shoulder probably a figure of the strength of the person, and that kind of concept. The key is this was everything except for the stuff that doesn't matter, and except for the sin bits, the unclean bits, they don't go to God. God doesn't want the sin, obviously. So here's a little summary. If you haven't been following, this is your little tune-in point. A burnt offering was given when an Israelite wanted to express. So it's they wanted to, it's voluntary. They wanted to express that even though they were a sinner and in need of salvation, they desired to give their whole life in dedication to God. Thus, or so, there were elements of atonement involved and the washing out of impurities, but the whole body was given to God as a pleasing aroma. And you can imagine how that would be pleasing to God when someone, it's like a baptism, isn't it? It's a washing away of the sin and it's a dedication to God. That this is pleasing to God. There's rejoicing in heaven when someone washes away their sins, repents, and says, I want to give everything to God. That's That's the symbol in this offering. You can't mandate that. You can't say, I command you to dedicate your life in complete service and give your whole heart, soul, mind, and strength. It's a bit of a oxymoron to say that that's the first commandment in a sense. How can you command someone to give their heart? But that's what God wants. He wants us to voluntarily say, I want to give everything to God. And obviously that is pleasing. Okay, so we've got a few minutes left, I think, and we're going to look at just a few passages where there are examples of burnt sacrifices. Yes, Benjamin.
With that slide previous, it doesn't necessarily mean forgiveness.
It says, and it will be accepted to make atonement for him. So when a person made a burnt sacrifice, God would forgive them.
I guess the difference that particularly gets picked up in Hebrews is that, without the shedding of blood, there can be no remission of sins. This was a process that needed to be repeated again and again, and it provided no way out of that cycle. Whereas better sacrifice of Christ, example of a life given complete dedication, that's something that does transform us. It doesn't keep us stuck in that cycle of sin.
Yeah, and let's remind ourselves, God didn't actually want sacrifices and offerings. What he wanted was for people to understand the principles demonstrated in them, and what God wanted was for people to be wanting to demonstrate that to him. So the person giving the burnt sacrifice wasn't thinking, when I kill this animal, God will forgive me for my sins. The person was thinking, God has done so much for me, and I love God, and I want to give everything to God. And to the extent, I want to demonstrate that in the way that he had ordained. And remember, think about this in the big picture of Leviticus. Sin excludes us. This is God teaching us how to come back into fellowship with him. And we come back into fellowship, acknowledging our sin, washing that away, and giving our whole lives to him. That's the big picture. Okay, we will go quickly through these. We're not going to turn up this one, but this is Samuel talking to Saul. Remember the Amalekites? And Saul said, oh yeah, the people kept the animals for burnt sacrifices, as if that was a good reason. What did Samuel say? Right. In other words, how could you really be dedicating yourself to God when you've just disobeyed him? It doesn't make sense. It's incongruous to say, oh yeah, God, I've decided not to do what you're doing, what you're telling me to do, because I want to dedicate myself to you. It doesn't make sense.
Also
So
keeping something back.
yeah. Obviously they were motivated by serving themselves. Psalm 51, let's look at this one, because the whole psalm has links throughout it about the burnt sacrifice. And this is a Bible class in itself, so we're going to be brief. I apologise. But the title of this psalm tells us this is a psalm of David when Nathan the prophet came to him and he realised and acknowledged his sin with Bathsheba. But look, I'm just going to pick out some verses. Verse 2, wash me thoroughly from my iniquity. Okay, so the washing of the burnt sacrifice. Verse 3, David said, I acknowledge my transgression. So in a person washing off the filth, they're acknowledging that there are sins in their lives. Verse 6, behold, you desired truth in the inward parts. So it's really about looking inward, not on the outside. Washing in verse 7, blot out my iniquities, verse 9, create in me a clean heart, he says in verse 10. So again, the picture of cleaning out the insides. He says, I'm just skimming through here. Verse 16, we quoted this before. So this is how we know the Psalm's really detailing burnt sacrifices. He says, verse 16, for thou desirest not sacrifice, else would I give it. You delighted not in burnt offering. Here's what it's really about, verse 17. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and a contrite heart, O God, thou wilt not despise. So this is someone who's saying, I'm a sinner, I acknowledge that, and I'm sorry about that, and I want to wash away the sin, and I want to give myself to God. That's a broken and a contrite spirit. It's a humble attitude. This is not a proud offering. It's not like, look how good I am. I'm going to give my whole life to God. It's not that at all. This is someone humbly saying, I acknowledge I'm a sinner, but I want to give myself to God. And look at the last verse of Psalm 51. Verse 18, do good in thy good pleasure unto Zion, build thou the walls of Jerusalem, which is essentially saying, bring the kingdom. And he says, then shalt thou be pleased with the sacrifices of righteousness, burnt offering and whole burnt offering. So the burnt offering is termed here a sacrifice of righteousness. And David's saying that in the kingdom, when God has built the walls of Jerusalem, then God will be pleased with burnt sacrifices. He's just said God didn't desire burnt sacrifices, but in the kingdom he will be. And the reason is, in the kingdom, that's when we will actually be able to give a dedicated service to God with no sin, completely free of those impurities. So I think that's a lovely little exposition of the burnt offering. We're almost out of time. I want to answer Matt's question. Let's skip to Numbers 28. This will be our last passage. I'll put some other references up later, but just to answer Matt's question, no, not just because of that, because it's this is just another key principle in the burnt sacrifice. If you've got the same Bible as me, at the top of Numbers 28, it's got the heading, the continual burnt offering. And does anyone have anything like a key phrase coloured in through this chapter? Okay, homework. Have a look at, let's just read the first few verses. Verse 2, command the children of Israel and say unto them, this is Numbers 28, my offering and my bread for my sacrifice made by fire for a sweet savour unto me shall you observe to offer unto me in their due season. And thou shalt say in verse 3 unto them, this is the offering made by fire which you shall offer unto Yahweh, 2 lambs of the first year, so under a year old, without spot, day by day, for a continual burnt offering. 1 lamb, verse 4, shalt thou offer in the morning, and the other lamb thou shalt offer at even. Verse 6, it is a continual burnt offering. So here's the idea. Every day, a lamb would be offered as burnt sacrifice in the morning, and it would actually burn on the altar throughout the whole day. And you can imagine there's not much left of it at the evening, and at evening they would offer the second lamb as a burnt sacrifice, and it would burn on the altar all through the night, and then at morning they'd repeat the process. In symbol, this was really 1 lamb. What do you think it's pointing forward to? Jesus Christ. 1 lamb, constantly, always burning, as a burnt sacrifice shows, as dedication to God. And the key phrase throughout this chapter, if you've got a little, if you've got the same Bible as me, underneath where it says chapter 28, it's got a little summary of the little sections. And there's section from verse 9 talking about on the Sabbath, verse 11 about new moons, verse 16 the Passover, the day of first fruits from verse 26. And what you'll notice if you read through this chapter is there's all these other offerings that happen on the Sabbath or on Passover or on these other special feast days. But it always says all those extra offerings are in addition to the continual burnt offering. And it kind of labours the point. Where does it say it? I should colour them into my Bible. Yeah, it's all through there. Verse 10, So this is on the Sabbath. You do these extra offerings. Verse 10, there's the burnt offering of every Sabbath beside the continual burnt offering. So beside the continual burnt offering is the repeated phrase through this chapter. And what it's saying is this: no matter what special things are happening, the daily burnt sacrifice, which points forward to Jesus, was always there as a constant, pointing forward to how Jesus continually, throughout his whole life, perfectly dedicated himself to God. And for the nation, not only was that pointing forward to Jesus, he was also telling them, like, this should have been the national mindset. The national mindset, there's always that smoke going up to God. There's always this burnt sacrifice happening. And the nation in symbol was saying, we're a nation dedicating ourselves to God. It's continual. No matter what's going on, Sabbath, new moon, feasts, whatever, we're doing this. We're dedicating ourselves to God. We're going to leave it there, but if you want some other references to examine, there's a couple of others. Thanks, Nick.